Good morning and welcome to today's presentation. We hope you're doing well, staying healthy and safe. Thanks so much for joining. Today's topic is China NMPA, Medical Device Regulatory Registration and UDI Submission. I'm Angela Alexandro, Head of Marketing for ReTech Life Sciences. We are recording today's webinar and all registrants will receive by email links to review the on-demand recording and the slides to share with your internal teams. If you have questions, feel free to submit them at any time in the Q&A panel. We will review and answer as many as possible at the end, and do submit those at any time. We'll follow up with you if we run out of time later in the week. We're quite privileged today to have a guest speaker. I'd like to introduce Grace Fupalma. She's the founder and CEO of China Med Device LLC. She has 20 years of experience driving product strategy. Sorry, get my slides moving here.
You're not advancing the slide.
Strategy, regulatory approval, business, and challenge partnership marketing for both large multinationals and startup companies. Grace is bilingual, bicultural. She has deep medtech connections and practical knowledge and experience in China. She's also the founder of the Chinese American Heart Association in 2005. And she also is a speaker and trainer, a writer for regulatory and clinical affairs meetings at medtech companies. A little bit about China Med Device, and Grace will get into this further, but they do provide regulatory and clinical services, and that includes the complete product lifecycle, strategy, registration, type testing, clinical evaluation report, full service CRO, PMS, first events, recalls, inspections. They have offices in Boston, Beijing, and Hainan. They are an acting NMPA China agent, so they do provide in-country representation services. They have market access services, market research and reimbursement, also distribution and partnership. A little bit about ReTech. We are in the medical device UDI space. We are industry experts, more than 15 years of SPL knowledge. We have participated in several pilots, including the FDA pilot. We're members of several trade groups, including MedTech Europe and GS1 committees. We are a major submitter to the FDA Good ID, and we are participating with EU UDI also. To date, we generally provide about 31% of all the FDA Good ID SPL records annually. We have over 370 customers and some of the largest medical device manufacturers in the world. And over 10 of our large customers have international users. We are also a member of several trade associations and collaborations such as One World Sync rather, and MedTech Europe. Okay, with that, our agenda, today's agenda, we'll talk about registration. We'll talk about China NMPA UDI policies, regulations, and standards. We will cover comparisons between the US, EU, and China. We'll talk a little bit about the ReTech UDI system and our experience with China submissions from machine to machine. Also, take your questions and answers. With that, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Grace to take us through China NMPA medical device registration.
Thanks for the opportunity to talk about China regulatory and the UDI. Before I start, I want to acknowledge the team who contribute to the presentation. My team in Beijing is midnight over there now, as well as the people we worked with on the UDI topic, Kate from Cook and Derek from Apex and Alex from Swiss and Nephew. Next slide. Next. Before we talk about the UDI, I just want to give a framework of the types of submission, and the regulatory pathway, and then we can talk more specific to the UDI. So in China, you have the new registration, similar to here, you have the 510K PMA. The equivalency in China is 3 classes, 2 and 3. Device and IVD are together, but IVD is separate from the instrument part from the assays part. In addition to the new initial registration where UDI is required when you register for class 3, I'll get into more the type of classification, the type of devices UDI. UDI has not 100% been implemented for all the classes, but for a segment of class 3 in the new registration, as well as the modification. You have devices been approved, but you need to, if you're in that classifications class 3 segment, you have modification. This is much more frequent in China, the requirement for modification, the FDA. A lot of the companies with 510K, you barely change anything, but in China, some of the considered minor, no change, but in China it's a modification. And renewal, every 5 years, you have to renew what you have. So the standards could change. Your renewal would have to capture that, even though your product did not change, but China standard changed. So you may still have to subject to a series of different things. So modification, renewal, the class 1 filing is not in the ERP system, is not required. So we're focused today on class 3, a small segment. That's where it's been implemented since January 1st of this year. Next slide. In terms of the key registration process, it's typically we go through the regulatory documentation, the technical requirements, and the clinical requirements. So this is the key process. The one you submit, typically you do the type testing clinical evaluation side before you submit. So when you submit this submission period for your registration, new registration process or modification change, you got to incorporate, if your device is within the segment of the class 3 device, you need to incorporate UDI within this process. So it's before, it's not after, like the US FDA. Next slide. So I'll talk a little bit about the key policies, regulations, and standards. In China, it's a centralized government, so everything starts at the policy at the State Council. That's kind of like a White House of China, executive branch. You have and the Congress together. So at the policy level, China's been started since 2016. Want to have a better traceability system. Want to also tie in the regulatory system with the healthcare reimbursement system. So the State Council has the 5-year plan at the policy level. Now we're in the 14th 5-year plan just started. So in the 13th 5-year plan, that's a biggie. If you do business in China, you should definitely read every 5-year plan. That shows what the Chinese government is focusing on. So at the policy level, the has been mandated, and then the NMPA used to be CFDA, stipulate what the regulation they need to do to support the State Council policy. So if you look at the CFDA level, there's in 2016 they have a very high level traceability, and the real thing did not happen until almost 2018-19 time period. In 2019-18, there was the draft, and then the actual implementation with the pilot program, not effective, but piloting with over 100 manufacturers and hospitals in the high-risk class 3, not all class 3, but the highest risk of mostly implants of the class 3 started in 2019. That's in the regulation column. You can see the rules to UDI system, degree number 66. That was implemented in 2019. That's a critical basic regulation. If you do UDI, you should definitely read it. I think our website may have an English copy of that. And then in addition to that, and then it prescribes the pilot project plan. That's started with the 56 specified how the pilot works and the type of products. So to support this implementation of regulation, you have the standards. Gary and John are going to further elaborate on these. I'm sure you're familiar with the ISO standard, but China has converted the ISO into the GB or YY standard. GB is more of the national, YY is the industry. So, and you have these standards that to support on the UDI that is relevant, the basic terms and the terminologies. So primarily at the implementer level, you should focus on the standards and the key regulations. Next slide. Next slide, please. So the key regulations is number 66. It's pretty much, if you look at the key elements and the components, it's very similar to FDA. This part, China NMPA tried to be more harmonized with the international regulatory bodies, so it's very similar. There are some Chinese specific requirements. If you look at the code issuing agency, GS1 so far is the largest one. Currently, with the implementation companies and the data set, GS1 occupies about 98%. So the rest companies mentioned here, the agencies, they're relatively small, like Ali Health and Zhongshan. The other thing to pay attention to is the reporting. The DI reporting has to be submitted during the registration, whether you do the filing or modification. And these are all detailed in the degree number 66. So like the identifiers of the smallest sales unit, and there will be more detail in the future slides. Next slide. So here's a quick timeline about the implementation that I mentioned earlier. So it started the pilot July of 2019 with 116 manufacturers from both US, Europe, all over the world, and China, domestic ones. This is critical for high-priced consumable, high-risk devices because these hospitals want to track this UDI. So certain hospitals now, if you don't have the UDI, you can't even enter the hospital. So if you're not in compliance yet, make sure that you do look into it. So the product initial focus, as I mentioned, is really in the high-risk area. So NMPA worked closely with the first batch of manufacturers. They worked out a lot of bugs, so you can see the different phases of 2019. And then 2020 is further development and enhancement. The originally it was going to be implemented and being effective in the October of 2020, but then that was delayed to first of this year. So the first batch has been implemented January 1st of this year. So if your device in that category, you would have to make sure your UDI is along with the other data uploaded in the China NMPA UDI database, and that website is public. This is the first batch of products that's been identified and been implemented. So it's piloted. There are 9 categories in this first batch. So you have the surgical instruments, passive. This is all class 3 devices. Certain imaging equipment implants, blood transfusion, and infusion type of products. So make sure that you check on the specific categories. In China, all the products, registered products, have classification, has categories. So that's a publicly available classification catalog. So you can look up the catalog and look at your categories to see if your product is within there or not. So 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 we can skip this part. We can go to the next slide. It's mentioned further about the 5 more high risk devices. So for China UDI and FDA UDI, it's adopted from US FDA UDI. It's pretty much most of the components are similar. The data elements are similar. The manufacturer provided all these, as you can see, with the elements comparison. On the left side, you see the comparison, the China UDI and then US FDA UDI. The name may be a little bit different, but it's pretty much it's the content, the gist is similar. So I'm not going to read through them. On the right hand side, you see the information. That's more the information specific to your product certificate. This is the critical information for your not only your regulatory approval but also your sales. This is information is also needs to be included in your UDI China specific database. So it's basically capture your product critical information on the product certificate and product certificate number, the validity period, the classification, the model. So these are all critical information that would be required for your UDI submission. Next slide, please. The importance of the difference is in the US device, you tend to say expiration date. In China, it's required is your manufacturing date a lot of times, and you see that reflected in your label. Your manufacturing date needs to be within your certificate validity date. Your certificate needs to be renewed every 5 years. So you need to be, and then when you renew, the number may change depending on what you're doing with your renewal. So making sure those numbers are consistent. So you're required to check your elements more frequently than you maybe your FDA certificate. And then the supply channel and the hospitals require you to include the manufacturing date because to the shelf life, and especially with the China healthcare patients environment, that's very critical. And the date format, pay attention, is a year, month, and day. So you have to have the complete format in order to be accepted. Next one. Next slide, please. So I mentioned briefly before about the DIs for the first time. In China, when you register new or after the compliance date, you have to include this during your registration, not after. And it's allowed, you can revise it. For instance, when you register your product, you don't, I think I have a slide later that you can upload it, but you do not have to publish. So you in the database, you can edit. Once you publish, you will not be able to edit much, but you are required to submit with your registration at the time of submission, not necessarily at the time of manufacturing. So these DIs needs to be included as part of your submission. Next slide. So in summary, the NMPA has implemented the UDI since January 1st of this year for a subset of the Class 3 devices. And it's particularly important is UDI. I'm sure the large company have heard of the volume purchasing. That's related to NISA, the China National Health Insurance Administration. So they are to track about the usage of the especially those high-priced consumables. The database are kind of trying to be linked together to facilitate future tracking as well. So talking about the future class 2 and other, the remaining of class 3 to be implemented is more pressure from the Chinese health authorities more than also the regulatory authorities, because the government wants to control spending. They want all these things to be tracked. So NMPA is the regulatory body that is implementing that. But this UDI has much bigger implementation than just a regulatory NMPA. And because the last point is linking the bidding price to the proper DI level, so they can track it before each province has its own different systems. But with this national database link, there will be a lot more transparency. So I think that's why the Chinese national government policy level is putting emphasis on the UDI. So I do expect that UDI across the board will be implemented a lot faster, I think, than the Western world. Next slide. They said, what best describes your presence in China and need for registration help? UDI, as I mentioned, they all require Chinese reading because everything, the database is in Chinese, and you need to navigate how to load it and how to sync with your other regulatory data. So if you do need a local agency, it's required if you don't have one. But local agency doesn't mean you have to set up a subsidiary. You do not need to. As mentioned, we can be your local agent. We can help you implement everything without you setting up any subsidiary.
All right, I'm going to close the poll here in just a second. Looks like few people still voting.
68% looks like you're all set. About 14% you have local need. Please feel free to email RETEC or us depending on your needs. Our contact information is listed in the back, also at the bottom footer of the PPT. In-country menu, and then the others is pretty small if you're inside the country. Okay.
All right, and we were going to launch the second one here at this point.
Describe the state of your product registration and UDI compliance. So as I mentioned, the class 3 section of class 3.
Yeah,
it's probably more global, more than China, right? This
is for China NMPA. So
oh, okay.
So have
so China UDI compliance. Okay.
Have products registered, but you need to comply, or you need to register new with UDI in the near future. Okay, so I'm going to close the poll. And it looks like it's kind of a three-way split there on the results.
Thanks so much for answering these questions. Looks like there also a lot of you need some help with new product registration along with the UDI. So this is a great forum for you. We have a lot of experience in not only the registration but also the UDI, particularly if you are large global manufacturers. To implement UDI, avoid error because there's so much data elements, is machine to machine if you're a large company. But if you are a smaller company, some of our clients are medium-sized company. They use Excel. So you load them into the Excel spreadsheet and then you upload it, and you have the Excel spreadsheet template is you can download it directly from the NMPA website. So if you have like J&J, large company, you would definitely need a RETEC type of machine to machine to make the global entry easier, especially if the manufacturer is in the US or EU. you have all those UDI data preloaded, and so you just add the China customized elements, which not that many, and then machine to machine would make absolute sense. But given the language barrier, as I mentioned, the China unique database, unique fields, so for smaller elements, we can certainly help you load those and making sure that the information entered appropriately, and you don't get into problems when you start selling the product. So next, I think, Gary, you're going to talk more about the differences, right?
Let me try to fix that. Thank you. So hopefully that's a little bit better. Thank you very much, Grace, for joining us. It was a pleasure having you go through some of the information and provide a lot of insight into the China NMPA market. What we'll do now is focus our attention on some of the standards and look at a side-by-side comparison of the US FDA, the European Union, and China NMPA. Before we go into some of those little details there was a International Medical Device Regulatory Forum that is still meeting and covers a lot of different topics, one of which is UDI, and they have put together a foundation, and many regulatory bodies use that as a starting point, not always adhering 100% to the guidelines, but using it as a launch point. And then the other supporting piece of groundwork is ISO standards. So there's a number of ISO standards that are applicable for using identifiers, the way UDI device identifiers are created and how they're represented. So there's a couple ISO specs there that you might want to take a look at regarding the characters and UDIs, and then also the presentation thereof in a barcode fashion. So that automatic identification and data collection, AIDC, would point you to some information about typically barcodes, and GS1 and others do have standards for radio frequency identification as well. But when you go beyond that foundation and start to look at what is available in each of these three different regions, there's a lot of similarities, and yet when you start to open the pages and you get to page 2 or 3, you suddenly realize things are a little bit different in each one of these regions. So typically they have this foundation of some legislation and a rule, if you will, and then many times the regulatory departments or centers or whatever they're referred to in a particular region, they layer on guidelines, and that is what really needs to be examined, because those particular guidelines tell you exactly how to proceed with complying with UDI. So on the left-hand side, there's a number of guidances referred to guidance for industry very frequently in the FDA. And then they also put a lot of information on their website as well. I find it very beneficial to poke around there and find that information. The European Union is not quite as mature, still forming, and those guidances are rolling out periodically. So you do have to keep an eye on those to keep track of what's going on. So there's obviously the medical device regulation and the in vitro diagnostic regulation forming the foundations, but when you really want to figure out how to do it, you need to look for that medical device coordination group, MDCG guidance, and start to keep track of what the details are. And in similar fashion for NMPA. So the basic ruling and legislation comes out, and then you do have a number of different guidance documents that help describe that particular activity. I expect both European and NMPA guidance documents to be rolling out a little bit further and provide more information. And eventually, as it has a mature set of regulations, a lot of the information would be covered. So those are a quick comparison, and similarities, a little bit differences. Now, When we take a look at some of the accredited issuing agencies, the European Union calls them issuing entities, but the FDA laid the groundwork because the timing thereof, and had approved GS1. As Grace had mentioned, this is the hands down most popular, a dominant player in this particular identification space for products. But there was also HIBIC, HIBCC, and also ICC BBA. I know it's an alphabet soup, but the last one there, pretty much for blood cells and in human tissues and so on, so not used much at all. And HIBIC does have a segment, but not certainly a minority, a very small number of devices use that particular standard. Then when the European Union came out, it was a little bit of a surprise. Not only did they accept and authorize the 3 that the FDA had accepted, but they added IFA, which is a German pharmacy type of a standard. I personally think it might be used for perhaps some combination products that might have an element of a pharmaceutical component in their product, but they were accepted as well. So now we have 4 for Europe. And the mix is a little bit different when we go to China. So GS1, again, the dominant player, Grace had mentioned, well over 90% of products in China are using that. But there are 2 others. So ZIIOT, it's an abbreviation for a pretty long name. You can look that up later. But I might refer to that as Ziot, just as a shortcut. And then the other, Ali Health, has a standard as well. And we'll take a look at that set of details on the next slide. So here this gets into a little bit of detail. We'll leave this for homework and not get too deep. But the 3rd and 4th row describing the device identifier and production identifier, they all have means and codes to identify the values and the attributes. So if you're using GS1, you're very familiar with the 11 and 17 and so on, and putting it parentheses and so on in the production identifier. Now, the one thing that I'll mention that caught my eye was both Ziot and Ali Health make use of the QR code as well as a linear barcode. So the QR code is available and widely accepted in Asia and used rather strongly, as I understand it. And that is a little bit different technology symbology than what the GS1 data matrix is. So if you're trying to figure all that out, be aware that if you go with a 2-dimensional code for the US or EU, there you would be using the GS1 data matrix. But if you go to a different standard, then the QR code becomes available. So yeah, let's go ahead and take a look at the next slide. It's just a quick reference for some of the repositories and the databases of where information is stored. US, you obviously have the Good ID database, GUDID, and then those supporting regulatory repositories, the adverse event MAUDE reporting database, and registration listing, and the total product lifecycle databases and so on. In UDI, as that is being rolled out, the European Union has 6 modules all connected together in a very large database. They have 6 different modules, one which is for the actor registration, or the long name, the economic operator registration. And the one that is most relevant for this discussion is the module that has to do with UDI and device registration. Certified bodies or certificates and notified bodies, the clinical investigation, vigilance, and market surveillance being the others modules. Now, December 1 of last year, the economic operator module was opened up, so I highly recommend you pursue that and get your registration in place for your single registration number, the SRN. And the next 2, UDI and the certificates, were expected to be open for a test playground But you know, John and I and others were a little surprised, but it was delayed for about 4 months to September. So that is still, you know, just keep your eyes open as to what's going on there. It was originally slated to open and be public May 26th, and now it's being pushed back to September. So again, it's one of the things you have to keep watching the websites because the news changes rather quickly. The last one I'll quickly mention is the National Health Security Database, registration database, and the adverse event. I'm a little bit more familiar with the registration database, not too much on the others. Grace, did you have anything to share on the databases in China?
It's similar to some extent. The web-based interface, you know, you have the UDI that you can register and load the data, and then that database is linked to the registration database. It's kind of like the top two, the 510K, the PMA. And in addition, as I mentioned there, the National Health Security Database, that's the insurance, like the U.S. Medicare or CBC, this CMC maybe. So these are the database that talk to each other. The adverse event database is not publicly available like the U.S. FDA. In China, adverse events is still closed within the NMPA firewall. So these, they talk to each other. You can see that.
Right. Thank you very much for that insight. Let's go to the next slide, Angela. And here we'll take a look at the way in which you procure and start to gather and create your device identifiers and production identifiers. So obviously you need to, if you are a labeler, therefore you have UDI responsibilities, select an agency and you can subscribe. It's a paid subscription to these issuing agencies. And then they have a lot of rules about how you generate the code. It has a various set of components. Obviously GS1 is most familiar with or widely used, and we can help you along that line if you have questions. Then once you have the identifier in place and assigned to your products, and that can actually take a while to figure out how that applies to actually base products and different packaging levels and kits and that sort of thing. There is a step along there where you do need to create an account with the FDA repository, the FDA Good ID, and then you can begin uploading. Now, in similar fashion, in China, there you are acting as a registrant. Again, you need to select your issuing agency. If you select GS1, obviously it would be common. Now you only have to work with one and learn one standard, and then generate the UDIs. And this is circled there is the important point Grace made earlier. That has to be done prior to your submission and included in your registration submission to your product. So that's very early on, much earlier than the FDA schedule. And then finishing that off, select your carrier, you know, one-dimensional, two-dimensional, how you're going to do that, upload data, and then enter into a maintenance model. Next slide, please, Angela. All right, we won't go into all of these, but it is becoming apparent that there are some fields that are common and you know might have the same identifier connected to them, and you might have some fields that are exactly the same as you go from US to China NMPA data set. Both of those, by the way, do not make use of the basic UDI hierarchy which the European Union makes use of. So it's a little bit more linear. It doesn't have that two-tier. But you will find definitely some fields that have definite regional differences. So a couple of them circuit there, the medical insurance number, your social credit number, identifying the actual business, and corresponding the DUNS number for US and SRN for EU. Some of the other classifications, the nomenclature codes are different. You have GMDN and EMDN, and again, a classification number used in China. So you just kind of have to be aware that just because you see a attribute name, it doesn't mean that the actual value is the same.
Right.
Many times it could be quite different. So let's go to the next slide. Now, editing the data, once the values are finally collected and ready to be submitted, you can go through this particular step here. For the US, you submit the record, you actually define when you want it to be published. So you can set that in the future or immediately. And then that starts a clock. So it used to be 30 days, but now it's 7 days. After 7 days, that particular record then becomes public, and you're able to see that in the public access GoodID database. And then you enter into some restrictions on what can easily be changed. There is an unlocking procedure that the FDA has come out with, where you can temporarily unlock a record and make changes to various fields, all except the published date. But there's a lot of limiting and some controls about those particular fields. NMPA has 3 steps where you have everything that is in draft mode, but obviously you can make full edits there. Then you're able to submit it, but it's on public, so you don't you have some key elements are not editable, so your device identifier and so on, but it's in this gray areas, but it's not fully. But once it does go and become published, now, as I understand it, it's a little bit more fixed, and you do have to have the authority to grant permission and make changes to those particular fields. So it becomes much more locked down once you publish. All to say, make sure what you submit is accurate, current, and correct. So it needs to reflect a very high quality data set before you actually submit it. All right, next slide, please. Once you do have a device identifier in place and recorded, registered, everything's good, you reported everything, you might have changes to your product. So various things can happen. You might come out with a new model or version, and there might be changes to the label. There's some time periods that the FDA has on when you have to report those changes. So if it's an attribute, but you're keeping the very same device identifier, for example, and it doesn't cause a new version or model in the particular attributes on the label, then you have to report that change actually before you commercially distribute that version of the new label. If it's not on the label, let's say it's an MRI field or some field that's not actually on your label, and then you have like 10 days after you actually make the change to report that. You might have situations where you have a significant design change, and now this is new model or version, and there's some other criteria, but now you have to create a new DI all the way on the right-hand side and create a brand new record. In similar fashion, European Union has a number of much more detailed examples and criteria about what needs to change or what will change and trigger a new device identifier. So there's guidance on that, and I expect similar type of guidance on the NMPA front as well. So next slide, please. Now there is this whole issue about what happens, when the compliance date rolls around. How does that transition actually occur? So there is this scenario in the US where if you had a product completely finished, labeled, without UDI on or prior to the compliance date, you could take that device, non-UDI, and distribute it for up to 3 years. After that, you'd have to pull it back and relabel it and assign UDI. Most of those compliance dates have long gone, by the way. So this doesn't enter into play anymore. Even your class ones, they go back to the original date to 2018. So I would imagine if you had products sitting around from 2018, you could claim this, but I seriously doubt there's a whole lot of inventory out there sitting on the warehouse for that long. Now, European Union approaches a little bit differently. So they have this concept of a legacy product, and legacy products are ones that are completely in force and being distributed right now using a directive. So the MDD, a medical device directive, and they would have a certificate, and as long as that is valid, they could continue to market that. And there's a break point up to 3 years. And when it's registered, there's no legislation that requires UDI to be applied to that particular legacy product because it doesn't comply to MDR legislation. But European Union has elected to apply alternative identifiers. So UDIMED ID and UDIMED DI will come into play. And that's all for another discussion. But there is this accommodation for legacy devices in Europe. China front, the ruling says anything that is changed or modified. So if you have a certificate that's changed, you definitely need to have that registered, and it includes UDI. So there will be an attrition as registrations expire, and then they need to be renewed. So I think that covers the section on there. I'm going to ask John to jump in and discuss some of the capabilities of the RETEC system and what our experience has been.
All right, thank you, Gary. And I'll try to be brief as possible, so maybe we could have a few minutes left over to address some of the questions coming in. So as we just heard described with the specific UDI requirement in China, it's also, it was also previously referenced that this is an ongoing global expansion of requirements, whereas you can see UDI initiatives specifically with loading UDI data into health authority databases has been here for a while, starting with the US and is expanding to other regions, notably in this conversation, China. So this is starting to, or it is growing, not just starting, it has been growing and it will continue to grow for years to come. So if you go to the next slide here, what we've been doing at RETEC is we have a product single source for medical devices, which is targeted to scale as these health authorities expand with their UDI database submission requirements. So the goal is to have a single platform that can be leveraged to manage your global UDI data and ultimately have workflows, submission channels to submit to the various health authority databases around the world. The next slide. So just getting a little bit deeper into the application. There's various abilities for medical device companies to interact with the application, whether they're coming into our user interface, loading the data using spreadsheets into our system. The difference between doing that and doing it directly in the health authority database is you're loading it into our platform from a global UDI data perspective, and you could leverage, reuse that data to achieve submissions to the various channels. Now, as Gary mentioned, a lot of the data attributes, I'll kind of refer to them as the questions that the health authorities asked about the information on your product. A lot of those could be the same, but the responses you give, the actual value to the attribute, could vary regionally. So the database is, the RETEC database is constructed to support data attribute values that are the same. It would be common with the actual value across the health authorities, but then also the ability to give specific responses, data attribute values for a particular health authority, such as China. So that comes in handy with some of those attributes that were discussed previously with product codes, classifications, and so forth that vary across region to region. And the application could also be utilized as an integration point with source systems. So we see organizations leveraging APIs we make available to assist with that. We have various customer-facing environments, starting off with a preview environment that's a sandbox, essentially, where clients could have access to the system and functionality as we're developing it. So we look to release that. This is pre-locking down into a release, into like a formal release that goes through computer systems validation. it's essentially an early QA type look, since there's been such rapid movement in industry globally. It gives external customers early access into that functionality and to see where things are heading. And then it starts getting a little bit more formal as that elevates into a pre-production UAT system. This is the controlled system after we go through our computer systems validation on our end as a software as a service provider, and make it available for clients to also perform their own UAT tests. With both of these environments, our goal is always to connect, if so offered by the health authority, to their pre-production and databases. Now, the NMPA, as part of the pilot information or phase, it wasn't until I want to say in the fall, maybe in the October timeframe, where they actually brought up a beta environment. So when they first started off with the pilot, there was only production. So that was quite a bit of a challenge and difference in working through the pilot initially, but eventually they brought up a beta, which is able to be used to perform test submissions. And when we get into South Korea, they actually do not have a pre-production environment, but they provide like an endpoint to test the machine-to-machine transaction. But that only could go so far. In our experience, we see folks like to do a test submission, then log into the test environment and look at the data to get that warm and fuzzy. So for like a South Korea, you don't have that full experience. You can test that the structure is proper. And it'll be interesting to see how that evolves globally as more health authorities bring things online. And ultimately the production system, which is controlled, the official data that is loaded into our system and leveraged for real production systems to the production databases. In this case, it would be the NMPA production UDID. Next. Yep, so that's my quick run through, Gary. If you just want to summarize these points here at the end.
Yeah, we have 2 slides here just basically to summarize the scenarios. This is a note card. It kind of pushes everything into one page. Won't go through that, but we talked pretty much about this. The only thing I'll mention at the bottom left, the timing for the remaining class 3, the class 2s, and the class 1s. There was some industry expectations that they would be, spaced out in a 2-year period. I think we're hearing that there was very good wide acceptance by the various hospitals in the receiving batch 1 information, and they were very interested in getting information for the rest of the classes. So industry might actually urge earlier timing. We'll see how that is affecting NMPA schedule. But these have not yet been published and firmed up. So just keep that in mind. We're waiting to hear some official numbers. And the next slide, this is a scenario that has come into play where we're starting to see, certainly in China, where there's a local representation that is required. South Korea has the same issue. Saudi Arabia has the same issue. So these requirements that you have local reps, and in some cases, it may have been a precedent to have a handoff where you basically gave all that responsibility to the local rep. It might be an affiliate, it might be a subsidiary, it might be your local office, it might be a separate independent agent, all of which are necessary for you to do business. What we are finding now is with the advent of single source for medical devices, this is a platform that has global capability and can serve each one of these regions. And it has those benefits that John was talking about, checks the data, keeps version control, it gives roles and responsibilities, visibility, it makes submissions, it makes sure that everything has been approved and confirms acknowledgments and so on. So there's many advantages of having a centralized submission system, electronic system. What we are finding though is it's more important than ever to include your local representation as team members. So you might now have a number of users that are local users, and they might be responsible for collecting a lot of the data, license data that they work with and have been involved with and actually are owners of. You might have some corporate information fields that the quote manufacturer would have ready at hand. So, it has to be a team effort now to collect all the data for UDI. And it's very easy to create those in-country users as members of your team and put them into the platform. Now, the value of that is they can handle the timing and the translation and be involved in the workflow. You might want to have a corporate person involved, and that's your discretion, maybe an approval step or actually even a submission step, but they can be involved and have visibility so that they can confirm that 1,000 records should have been submitted, and sure enough, look at that, they all were. Oh, but wait, here's 10 of them that have not. Maybe I need to investigate those 10. How come I'm 10 short? Or of the 990 that were in fact submitted, maybe 15 of them were rejected. So now you have visibility to that, and you can work with the local agent to resolve that. So we're seeing a little bit different approach necessary for these new regions. And with that, I'm going to close, and let's get the last two polls in place, and maybe squeeze in a couple of questions, Angela.
All right. So the next poll is, what class of devices do you need to submit for China NMPA?
So I guess if you were negligent on your batch one, you should need to do that, or maybe you already did. There's some remaining class 3 devices that would definitely be outstanding, and then ongoing class 2s and class 1s. Let's just see the mix out there, see what people have.
Close the poll and share the results.
It looks like class 2 overwhelming majority here, 49%.
Yep.
A lot of remaining class 3s, which is very interesting, 34% there, and 9% that need to be registered. So maybe they're just not on the horizon. I would expect class 1 to be a little bit higher. Let's go to the next poll there, Angela, as well.
All right. So how are you planning to submit UDI for China NMPA?
So your first option there would register, go to the NMPA website and do manual entry. So basically key in the values into a web form. The second option would be to make use of spreadsheet, which would have those fields identified, and fill in the spreadsheet, upload those spreadsheets. And then the third option would be a model like John had described, where you have data handled in a more structured repository and submit that electronically through a machine-to-machine transfer connection.
All right. Looks like we've got our votes in. And the results.
For this sample size, I'm going to call it pretty much even. Spreadsheet a little bit larger, so that's very good. Are we able to get a question, 1 or 2 questions in before we close out, Angela?
Yeah.
Just a quick comment for the spreadsheet upload. Is you're not creating your own spreadsheet. There's templates also available at the NMPA UDI site. So there are also, if you read Chinese, there are tons of educational material there as well. And the success is really, as Gary said, is in addition to your corporate user and your local agent like us to access the machine-to-machine, the data platform that RETEC has, is also the supply chain, your QA people. So it's a team effort to make sure that there's no mistake being made. I think with the automation side, to avoid some whenever you have more than 2 people talking, there's a gray area. So to avoid some of these gray areas mistakes.
Yeah, so I think it's very important to include the local agent in China Medical Devices. Certainly one option for you. And we would think that it would be a great candidate if you were to use them, and they could become a user in the RETEC system as well. So keep that in mind, and that's one of your scenarios working forward, and would be great to all be on the team helping you meet the regulations for UDI registration.
Just a couple last-minute questions coming in here. Is it correctly understood that NMPA requires that the data for the UDI database align with the certificate and not as such the label?
The key information is pulled from your registered certificate. So the label needs to be, it is one of the requirements for registration. Your label needs to comply. So your certificate number, key information on your certificate need to show up in your label. So those two are two separate things. And UDI does need, once, if you are in the batch 1, class 3 segment, your UDI info needs to be on your label. So those two are related, but the direct data that NMPA pull from is the certificate registration database.
All right. Next question. Do you need to resubmit to the China UDI every 5 years, or do you register only once?
If you are in there, you just do the modification, the change request. If you've never been there, and then you need to apply.
All right, and one last question as we're 5 minutes over. Is the manufacturing date mandatory in the UDI PI for China? This would require something different for UDI for China?
I believe that's how the UDI is constructed, specifically with the production identifier. Are you using the manufacturing date versus expiration date, lot or batch number, or even the serial number? So that's pretty consistent, for example, with the US. For the actual database submission, you're not including the date if that was how you are controlling the production identification. It's very similar to US, where you're just answering a question. Do you control the PI by your manufacturing date, or is it expiration date, or lot or batch number, or serial number? So I think your question is probably related to around whichever is used. One may change more frequently than the other, or be different than what you're using in other regions. So it appears that it's not required to be controlled through that, but it has to be controlled through one of those mechanisms.
Okay. Thank you so much to our presenters, Grace Palma from China Med Device LLC, and Gary Sainer and John Lawrence of ReTech. We're out of time. If we did not answer your question, we will circle back to you in the coming days, one-on-one. Thank you to everyone who participated today. Thank you for participating in the polls, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening.
Yeah, thank you very much, folks.
Look forward to hearing you, meeting you one day. Bye.